"Don't go. Your driver has a gun." The words left Amara like a small, deliberate motion, soft, precise, almost embarrassed by their own audacity. She had been smoothing Charles Whitmore's tie in the hangar for years. The gesture was as ordinary as the smell of engine oil that clung to the leather seats of his private jet. The light there was cold and untempered, a wash of blue that flattened faces and made shadows look like deliberate things. Tonight it gave everything a clinical clarity. The shine on the tie, the line of Charles's jaw, the dark, compact shape tucked in the chauffeur's footwell. Victor's hand hovered, then stilled. For a breath, the three of them were only a photograph. Charles mid-fix, Eli at his side watching with a child's small impatience, Victor looking too composed for what Amara had seen. Then Daniel, Charles's head of security, moved. He was a man of measured motions who kept his face like a ledger, but the muscle along his jaw tightened. He took a step toward the car and his voice dropped, even in the hangar's wide echo. "Out, all of you. Now." The chauffeur climbed out with the syrup-slow politeness of a man trained to expect gratitude. He did not argue. Victor's palms showed faint sweat at the base of the thumbs. His shoes made an almost apologetic scuff on the concrete. Someone called in backup. Someone else locked the hangar door. Inside, the jet's hum was a small, mechanical animal, a low vibration under everything. The world narrowed to the small, bright battery of Daniel's flashlight as he reached beneath the dashboard and found steel. Charles's grip on Amara's wrist was brief and public. "You saved my life," he said. The words were too large for the place. Eli, who was 7 and precise, looked from his father's face to Amara and then to the seat. There was a new angle of fear in his small face that Amara could not fix with briscong kisses or a joke. She said only, "You should not have to be seen to be safe," and then she tightened her hand around the brace she always wore. Marcus had braided it when Eli was born, and walked out into the blue light, and the reporters who would arrive later, and the men with radios who had suddenly become the center of this night's gravity. The immediate work was practical. Daniel's team held Victor in the hangar office until the local police took him into custody. Tape was stretched across the jet like a promise. Agents photographed Victor's uniform, his shoes, the floor mat, the exact angle where the gun had been tucked. There would be statements to be recorded, fingerprints, and the kind of small procedure that left a paper trail. Charles ordered the jet grounded. The word "tonight" slid in under everything. Tonight it had been averted. Tonight it might have been different. That night, under the too bright fluorescence of an impromptu command post set up in the hangar's office, Amara watched the men in suits move like chess pieces, all of them occupying a narrow world of tasks. Call the DA, alert the private legal counsel, secure the family, and, because money and power live in their own risk calculus, conduct internal sweeps. They did not call it a scandal, they called it a vulnerability. "If that moment kept you on edge, tap-like," Margaret said, then realized she had spoken aloud to no one. The voice was hers because the DNA of the evening drew in other actors. Daniel frowned in the half-light. He had been with Whitmore Holdings long enough to know that gratitude did not amount to immunity. It was a ledger entry, sometimes a dangerous one. But he also knew the shape of Amara's look, not fear, recognition. Amara lived inside the rhythms of the house. To say she was a housekeeper was to understate the calendar of her days. She cooked dinners that fit into the sharp edges of Charles's schedule, folded shirts in the narrow geometry of Sunday mornings, smoothed Eli's hair the way a person might press a promise into fabric. She had come to the Whitmore house as a practical necessity years before, a job in a city that made it hard for good people to find small, steady work that honored them. Her hands remembered the collars and the hiss of steam and the exact moment when a man like Charles needed to be reminded to breathe. She was black, yes, a fact she lived with, and that other people noticed in particular ways. But the identity she carried was fuller than the label. It included Marcus, teaching algebra in a crowded classroom, the bracelet Marcus had braided, the sound of Eli learning to whistle, the careful ledger of bills she kept in a tiny notebook she kept folded in her purse. Once Victor was in custody and the scene secured, Daniel requested a sweep of the house. Margaret Rhee arrived with a terse, efficient posture and a clipboard she used like a weapon. She had a counterintelligence team behind her that smelled faintly of too strong coffee and the coastal wind. Where Daniel's men moved with muscle, Margaret's people moved with patience and the soft cruelty of people who had learned to read data the way others read faces. She was not theatrical. She was precise, and she had the right to be. They began with the obvious places, under tables, behind paintings, inside light fixtures. They opened the credenza in the boardroom, and a small, unremarkable black disc slid free. A microphone, no more than 100 grams of carefully masked plastic. Amara knew that object in the way someone knows a bruise, a small thing that reframed a life. The credenza had been a gift from Charles to the company years before, a polished walnut piece that held nothing but company plaques and a small silver bowl for business cards. The bug's lens had been hidden in a brass ornament. It did not record what should not be known to the world. It recorded what powerful people thought they could own, the intimacies of private meetings, the sound of forgiveness, the hiss of a reprimand. They catalogued it. The hum of servers became a background motif in the days that followed, rack by rack in a secure room, LED lights blinking like a heart monitor. Margaret's team cross-referenced the microdot signal and found a relay that did not sit on Whitmore Holdings' network, but painted its voice through a web of shell servers and rented exit nodes. Someone had paid for invisibility and sent their ears through a marketplace. Marketplaces had rules. Somebody kept receipts. Vanessa Sloan, who had worked in the Whitmore Vendor Relations Office for 8 years and had the kind of low-visibility access that let you see things no one wanted you to see, made a single decision that would pivot the investigation. She was a soft-spoken woman with a face that suggested she had spent much of her life cataloguing other people's needs. Vanessa's handwriting on the small note she slipped into a courier envelope was careful and small. The note read, "I can't stay. USB in case. Meet before the gala." Amara found the note when she returned home after hours of questioning. She had given a statement, of course. Her hands had been asked to replicate the angle of her discovery, the casualness of her warning. She had stood while men in suits spoke like people reading from manuals. The house felt like an animal with its ribs pressed close. Eli slept in the study with a blanket thrown over the sofa. Marcus called from his classroom. Her brother's voice was quick with the tired jokes of teachers. He did not yet know the way someone's life could be shifted by a single photograph. The photograph arrived late, inside a plain envelope with no return address. The picture showed Marcus standing in front of a bus stop, his face angled away but unmistakable. His hair, the slant of his nose, the way he tilted his head when he explained math to a student. Written across the back in block letters was the sentence that landed like a weight. Everything has a cost. Amara held the photograph over the sink as if heat would make it evaporate. The kitchen light made Marcus's eyes dark in the frame. The bracelet Marcus had braided, she could see it on his wrist in the picture, caught the sun. She could imagine the photograph being taken from a car's rear-view mirror, the sort of casual surveillance that did not look like surveillance at all. It was an intimate instrument, turned toward threat. Daniel's voice on the phone was unyielding. He began with practical steps. Marcus would not sleep at his apartment for a while. He would stay with a colleague. The school's administration would be notified discreetly. Margaret wanted to trace the photograph's metadata, to know the route it had taken, the cell phone tower, the upload point, the transfer logs. Legally, they had to be careful. They needed probable cause to seize servers, and the servers were often domiciled in places that respected the laws of shadow and corporate anonymity. They would need to obtain warrants, warrants needed evidence, evidence needed chain of custody. The world had rules, and those rules could be slow. Amara made two choices then in the small private theatre of that night. The first was practical. She took Marcus's bracelet out from her pocket and slid it onto her wrist. It was a small talisman, braided with 3 colors of thread, that meant less as color than as not, something to make the world feel tied together. The second was internal. She acknowledged, in a way that had no ceremony, that she had been seen. Not in the domestic sense of being noticed for a service rendered, but seen as a vector, as someone who knew things that could hurt other people. Her competence had made her a type of witness, and witnesses have costs. The bug's discovery pushed them toward the networks. Margaret summoned the cyber forensics team, specialists who smelled faintly of late nights and stale coffee, whose hands were quick and whose language was economical. They began with the microdot signal and worked outward, a spidery map of packets, relays, and drop points. They followed a trail that passed through a handful of shell companies, corporate ghosts with addresses that resolved to postal boxes and accountants, and ended in a storage facility on the edge of the city, populated by businesses that rented storage units to nondescript themselves. At the same time that Margaret unraveled the technical trace, she met with Charles and his counsel to explain the legal constraints. Charles sat in the Whitmore family office, his face thinner in the aftermath of sleep lost and age rebalanced by grief. He had been a man of private grief for years. His wife had died in a way that had made the public parts of his life awkward, and he listened now as a man who had been startled awake. Margaret's explanation was blunt. Seize the units if they can get a warrant, but cautioned, expect leaks, expect denials, expect countersuits. The legal world creaked like old furniture. Victor, meanwhile, sat in the station on a mattress of acrid coffee and fluorescent light. He was quiet, and in his silence there was the slow revelation of a man who had not believed his voice would land in a place that would listen. He asked for counsel. He confessed to some things and withheld others. He spoke often in arithmetic, names, sums, rendezvous, a promise of payment, a name that had been repeated as an invoice. Elias Kane. Daniel read Victor's words as if they were numbers to be subtracted. Victor fed a frequency of guilt and fear. He had been paid, he said. He had been afraid. He had not been the architect. Elias Kane's name had a soft weight to it when said aloud in the hallway between legal counsel and security. It sounded like something appropriate to the top of a ledger. Margaret frowned at the way Kane's holdings masked themselves in subsidiaries and cultural philanthropy. There were plaques bearing Kane's name in places that asked for money and not questions. If Kane was the node, he was also where power gathered its softest velvet. Amara's life, for its intimate ordinariness, began to take on a public edge. She found herself the center of conversations her hands had never been trained to navigate. Press management, witness protection briefings, the terms of potential testimony. She steadied herself by returning to the small tasks that had always kept her buoyed. Eli's breakfast, the way she smoothed his school uniform, tucked a small, crooked note into his lunchbox that was a joke and a blessing. Marcus called at odd hours, his voice chafed by worry for his students rather than for himself. He tried to sound light. He had always been a man who used humor to make math less a mountain. "Just keep a low profile, Amara," he said. "Don't do anything dramatic." Amara laughed, something thin and brittle, because she knew he was right, and also because she wanted to tease him into believing this was merely inconvenience rather than a rabbit hole. They set up an overnight watch on Marcus's phone, digital shepherds who ensured his location pinged to safe hands. Margaret's people placed a small legal tracking device, not the clandestine kind, but a sanctioned app with proper warrants to run if there was probable cause. They were choosing methods that would hold up in a courtroom, that would not be tossed out for lack of chain of custody or breach of privacy laws. They were choosing patient, methodical containment over the thrill of immediate confrontation. Vanessa's note had been a crooked hinge. A day after the photograph arrived, there came a short, almost clinical message through an encrypted account. "I have something, not much time. Meet at the coffee stall on the corner of 3rd and Linden, 10 a.m. She signed it with only her initials, VS. Margaret cautioned that meetups like that were dangerous. Agents could turn the meeting and secure the informant if they wanted, but doing so risked spooking any other insiders who might be watching. Daniel recommended they let a plainclothes officer watch from across the street, a small human safeguard that did not look like a sweep. Amara said she would go. She had been the one who found the gun. She had a kind of ownership now. If Vanessa had something, it could be a photograph of a ledger or a login sheet or a sequence of payments. Marginal things, perhaps, but those were the things that created logic in a forensic timeline. The coffee stall was a narrow storefront with a huddle of tables under a awning, the kind of place where men in suits pretended comfort and baristas observed everyone like archivists. Vanessa sat with her hands wrapped around a paper cup, a blanket of small scars in the corners of her mouth where politeness had been practiced like a muscle. She gave Amara the USB at the exact length of casualness a woman could offer another woman in a public place. No one noticed, not really. People noticed more the way Amara's bracelet flashed in the sun than the fact that she now held evidence. "I had to be careful," Vanessa said. "I have kids. I can't—" Her words ended and reconstituted into something practical. "There are invoices, routing numbers, payments to shell companies. There are servers in a cluster, one in Jersey, one overseas used as relays. It's small, institutional stuff. They rent it like you would rent a boat." They both used small shorthand for criminal dignity. Vanessa had worked vendor relations. She knew how companies hid things. She had seen the rotating labels, VIP rotate, in a vendor's notes, dehumanizing language that referred to living rooms and bedrooms as product lines. The USB contained raw entries, not yet explained by legal narration. It had the smell of danger in its electrons. Amara did not hand the USB to Margaret then. Margaret's eyes had been on the cup of coffee like a thermometer, and she had watched Vanessa from the distance of professional habit. "You did the right thing," Margaret said when she finally joined them, having watched in the half-light. "But you did more than that. You sat on it when sitting would have been safer." "I couldn't," Amara said. "I can't look at Marcus and not do something." Margaret's expression softened. "We will need to pull chain of custody fast. If we let someone else touch that USB before we photograph it and log it, it could be contested. We need to record everything." It was the kind of language that made actual law feel like a stitched garment. They photographed the USB against a neutral backdrop, with Margaret's team standing like witnesses. Daniel took a number of notes that made a pale nebula around the evidence. Time, place, the name of the provider. Someone called a DA on a secure line to prepare for the next steps. They moved forward with the kind of slowness that protected them later in court. That night, before the city had folded its lights into the night like so many small offerings, Daniel phoned Marcus. His voice was steadier now. "Do you want us to remove you?" he asked plainly. Marcus said no at first. Then he breathed and said he would leave the next day. He could stay at a friend's house uptown, teach remotely. He was a man who taught tangents and proofs to teenagers and sometimes allowed himself to believe that bravery was one kind of quiet arithmetic you practiced in small ways. "I'll rearrange my week," he said. "Students depend on me." Amara rested her palm on the photo of Marcus while Eli slept. The house had a rawness, every sound amplified. She pressed her thumb to the edge of the picture until the paper bent like a small prayer. In the following days, the investigation braided itself into a visible rope. The discovery of the bug and Vanessa's USB gave them a narrative thread, but the thread ran through a ballast of money and institutional opacity. Margaret lined up subpoenas. She and the DA discussed jurisdictional strategy. She made notes about probable cause and the likelihood of success if they sought warrants for the storage facility. The server owners were often careful, their incorporation papers a hedge against curiosity. Margaret and Daniel orchestrated a series of administrative moves that were deliberate and legal: assistant DA reviews, magistrate consultations, and a quiet, strategic leak to a trusted journalist to seed the public record in a way that might be useful if the defense attempted to muddy water later. Elias Kane was an elephant in the hall, mentioned by Victor and visible in the ledger entries Vanessa had handed over. But there was no single smoking gun that screamed guilt in a way the law would accept. There were instead patterns, payments to shell entities, contractor-like invoices with vague deliverables, and a dizzying tangle of cross-payments from people who had something to lose. Margaret's team traced a few payments to accounts that did not show up in public filings, then followed those accounts toward an industrial complex of storage units. The hum of servers persisted as a motif in her head. She imagined them in rows like teeth, blinking with other people's private lives. Charles called a meeting of the board. Gerald Clean, a board member with a soft, careful tone, listened from the elliptical chairs, like a judge who had run out of bench and could only participate in corporate morality as an observer. Charles, who had been a man of private grief and public philanthropy, said little at the meeting. His staff did the talking. He asked for one thing: change. "We can't be complicit in a system that sells privacy for profit," he said in the later recounting of that meeting. The words were not revolutionary, but they had the weight of a man who had not wanted to be seen until he had to be. The story gathered attention. There were polite inquiries from reporters who wanted to know the shape of the scandal without touching the family. There were more vulgar ones, too, and Amara learned the economy of privacy in America was not only the market for data, but a currency of fear. She watched the unpleasant way cameras turned toward someone like her, not for her skill, but for the spectacle of her proximity to power. She learned to feel both the shield and the sting of being visible. Then came the small but consequential piece of evidence, a vendor memo that showed a rotation schedule stamped VIP Rotate and a markup column labeled Visibility Fees. Vanessa's USB revealed line items that named houses and dates. In one instance, a fee had been paid to capture a domestic argument at an expensive townhouse. In another, a relay had been used to capture the live audio of an executive's private apology. The spreadsheet's numbers were dull and murderous, a ledger that turned intimacy into a subscription. The moral algebra of power was becoming legible. Visibility, in this sense, had been commodified. To be seen now could be an asset or a weapon. Those with money could command the commodity, while those without money could find their private moments uploaded, archived, and resold. Late one evening, after paperwork that wanted to swallow the night, Margaret came to Amara's kitchen with a folder. "We're thinking bigger," she said. She explained a plan that depended on drawing Kane's network into a trap. Make them believe their feeds were still operational, create a controlled sting at the gala, and use the gala's visibility as a stage to prompt the network to show its hand. It was an audacious move, the kind of gambit that required nerves and a slow faith in procedure. The gala, one of those thinly disguised corporate benefits, would be public, and they would use its choreography to flush out the relays. Amara listened, hands folded around the bracelet. Eli had announced that he wanted to sleep in his own bed that night, and the thought of leaving him to the normal noises of childhood felt like a small betrayal she tried not to quantify. Margaret, who had the look of someone who had lived in rooms filled with other people's secrets and learned to keep them tightly, added, "If we do this, we need you in your normal place. We cannot risk making you someone people will try to exploit. You will be essential because you are every day." It was the crucial observation. They needed Amara not because she had fought in any formal sense, but because she embodied the ordinary seam between domestic life and the powerful. She could move through rooms without drawing attention. She knew the way charity events worked and could be present without posing. Daniel briefed her on the precautions. They would have extra security in the wings, a plainclothes operator holding the line, and technical watchers listening for the particular signature of Kane's feeds. Margaret explained that seizing any servers would mean warrants, magistrates, and possibly a fight in court. They would need to manufacture probable cause without violating privacy laws. This meant patient build-up, logs, payment records, co-conspirator statements. The timeline stretched like a wire. Amara's eyes kept returning to the photograph of Marcus, to the way everything has a cost had turned small domestic motion into a threat. She was also aware, with an ache and a vigor, that she had a role she could not abdicate. This was not bravado. It was a ledger of fidelity. The days that followed were a rhythm of small violences. Mornings of school sandwiches and whispered instructions for Marcus's temporary arrangements, afternoons of depositions and secure rooms where servers hummed, nights of strategy and the thin dread of becoming known as someone who could be targeted. Margaret and Daniel worked with the DA to draw up an affidavit that would let them access the storage units. They looked for the proof that would hold in front of a magistrate, the microdot signal history, Victor's partial admissions, Vanessa's USB with the vendor invoices, and the chain that connected payment to purposeful listening. They sought to create a legal rope that would bind the men who were paid to listen. Amara found herself preserving small private rituals. She made Eli a breakfast the way Marcus taught her to do scrambled eggs, slow, patient folding. She ironed the shirts of men who would never know that their fabric had been the thing that kept her steady. She wrote in a small journal at night, the words sharp and brief: "Tonight, held. Tonight, proof. Tonight, bracelet on." The word wrapped the days into a beat she could count. And then Vanessa called. Her voice had a thin note of triumph that was also fear. "I found a routing log," she said, "a time-stamped transfer." She had tracked a payment that originated from an account tied to one of Kane's shell companies and moved through 2 offshore accounts before settling into a cluster of payments that had been labeled with the VIP rotate code. "It isn't a person," Vanessa said. "It's a system, an infrastructure. But it leaves footprints." Margaret's face, when Amara passed her in the hall, had the pale glow of someone who had found a door ajar. "It isn't everything," she said, "but it's enough to get a warrant for the storage facility." "What does that mean?" Amara asked. She felt the sound of her own voice as if it belonged to someone else. Margaret chose her words carefully. "It means we have cause to show a magistrate that there's probable evidence stored in that complex which supports our belief that unlawful surveillance is being sold. If we get the warrant, we seize servers. Seized servers can be forensically imaged. Their contents can show us the feeds, time codes, and possibly even the stream labels, what they were calling the houses. Those terms have to be linked to the payments. If Vanessa's USB ties the payments to the streams, we have a chain." There was a legal elegance to the way the case knitted together, and there was also the bluntness of the thing. A warrant could be denied. A server could be wiped. A leak could muddy the waters. The law was not a clean instrument. It was a process that required patience and care. Amara listened and allowed herself to be a node in someone else's plan. She agreed to be at the gala in the way she had always been, unassuming, competent, and close to the domestic core of the event. She would stand in the margins of the ballroom, hold Eli's jacket when needed, fix a cuff that had come loose. The plan counted on her ordinariness like a lantern. Later, she sat alone in the kitchen and folded the photograph of Marcus into her palm, like a small thing made of paper and consequence. The bracelet on her wrist felt heavier than usual. The hum of the servers, an indirect soundtrack she had come to carry, sounded now like an instrument tuned to the same pitch as the city's restless night. She tasted coffee with a thin metallic tang and wished for the dull, steady hands of the math teacher who could make sense of angles and probability. She breathed out. "Tonight," she whispered, the word both a talisman and a metronome. Tonight they had stopped a gun. Tonight they could try to stop a system. Tonight a photograph of her brother had arrived with a price tag. Tonight had become a way to measure the thin thread between the domestic and the industrial. Margaret and Daniel drew up lists and maps. They scheduled meetings with local prosecutors and the federal office who had interest in cross-jurisdictional offences. They ran small practice simulations, not of combat, but of evidence control. Each movement toward the storage facility would require legal muscle and the kind of coordinated patience that made a courtroom viable. They could not simply storm in. The law was not a drama that permitted theatrical arrest without the scaffolding of probable cause. Amara slept poorly for nights, waking at small hours to check Eli, then to check her phone for any message that might disclose Marcus's location. She practiced restraint. She practiced the quiet competence that had always been her work. She also kept the photograph in a place that felt like prayer, a drawer where the smell of lavender sachets kept the world softer. On a Tuesday morning, Vanessa sent a short message with a file attached, a CSV with a primary key and a set of line items. Among the items was a label that made Amara's stomach drop for reasons that were not only procedural: Whitmore Holdings, boardroom meeting, 0312, 7:15 p.m., recorded. Someone had paid to record their own boardroom. The implications were more complicated than one person could hold. Why would a boardroom need to be recorded? By an outside seller of surveillance? Did someone want a copy for leverage? Had someone thought the board needed archiving? Margaret read the CSV with a look that was almost mournful. "They didn't just record secrets," she said slowly. "They made intimacy a product line. They sold lives." The city's political classes buzzed like insects around a light. There were calls from people who hoped to be helpful. There were those who wanted credit. And there were lawyers who reasoned out loud about liability. The whole affair sat in the intersection of private grief and public consequence, the way a cracked pavement sat where two different road crews had never agreed on blueprints. For Amara, the stakes were lodged in her throat and her wrist. Marcus's face in the photograph, Eli's small hand when he reached for the jacket, the way Charles's voice softened to her in the hangar. All these things were now part of the ledger. She had moved from worker to witness. She had witnessed a gun. She had been a necessary small voice that altered a night's trajectory. Then in an unexpected hour, Vanessa sent one more note. "There is someone inside who is afraid. We might get more. Meet tonight, late. I will call." The message shifted something in Amara from the theoretical to the immediate. The word "tonight" folded around her like a hand. There was a risk in meeting, but there was also an imperative. Vanessa's fear spelled possibility. It could also be a trap. The possibilities arranged themselves on the table like pieces in a game she had not asked to play. Daniel, when informed, said they could provide surveillance and a safe space, but they could not push Vanessa to meet if she was not ready. Margaret wanted to use the meeting as a controlled point, to attach cameras, audio logs, and to have a plainclothes separator nearby. But those were the kinds of strategies that made insiders wary. They sought safety, but feared manipulation. Amara thought about Marcus and counted the cost of not walking toward the risk. She had been ordinary for too long, in ways that had made her invisible to the kind of violence that traded on sight. She put the photograph in her pocket as if carrying a coin that might buy passage. That night, in a small park near the coffee stall where Vanessa had first met her, the city air felt thin and the sky a washed-out lead. People were moving in lines that had nothing to do with her. A woman sold tamales from a cart. A man walked by with a dog. Teenagers laughed with the particular loudness of those who do not yet know how fragile some nights are. Amara sat on a bench and watched lights across the street, the way they blurred and returned. The city's hum was its own kind of server, a multiplicity of sockets and lines. A figure approached the bench, tentative and quick, the shadow of a person trying to be small. Vanessa had brought a sealed packet this time, a printed-out invoice with an annotation in red ink, a phone number that hadn't been in any of the registries, a name of a facility 2 postal blocks from the storage units Margaret was preparing to serve. "They rotate the labels periodically," Vanessa said, "but sometimes people get sloppy. They reuse words." Amara held the packet and felt the weight of it like a tangible promise. "What do you want?" she asked. Vanessa's voice softened into an almost confessional whisper. "I want to stop being part of it. I can't live like this. I can't have my kids' lives." She stopped, and the sentence dissolved into the park air. "I want out." Amara saw the shape of fear there and recognized it as something she had carried in other people's faces when she soothed a child or ironed a shirt. She understood that courage could be mundane, the courage to walk into a cafe and hand over a USB, the courage to call a number and ask for help. Vanessa's courage was the small, durable kind that made investigations possible. They arranged, in a hush of practical decisions and soft warnings, to meet with Margaret the next afternoon to formally hand over the evidence. Margaret, who had always been exact, asked simple, legal things: to document the meeting, to photograph the evidence, and to ensure Vanessa's identity would be protected. Vanessa agreed, slack and fearful and grateful in equal measure. Amara walked home with the packet under her arm. She felt the weight of it not as burden, but as battery, something capable of powering a legal engine forward. The city lights made the bracelet on her wrist glint, as if with approval. At home, Eli was waiting with a puzzle he had abandoned, pieces scattered like small promises. Marcus had not yet chosen to leave, though his bags were half-packed. The photograph sat between them like a silent witness. Amara kissed Eli good-night and tucked him under blankets with a tenderness that felt like armor. She told him a small, ridiculous story about a robot who misplaced his bolts. Eli laughed and slept. Before she went to bed, Amara wrote one sentence in her notebook in a hand that trembled only minutely. "Tonight we learned they sell sight." The words sat like a confession, a report, and a vow. They were moving now toward an irreversible action, a warrant application for the storage facility. Margaret had the logs. Victor's confession had given them a name. Vanessa's USB had the invoices. The stars for a legal strike were aligning, but the law, like moths, had its own rhythms. The magistrate's calendar, the DA's sign-off, the logistics of entry, all of it required timing. Amara slept with the photograph under her pillow that night. She did not sleep more than a few hours, and in the intervals she practiced a kind of fierce listening. The sound of Eli's breath, the distant noise of the city's servers, the low hum of consequence. The word "tonight" returned, and felt less like a threat and more like a clock whose hands they could move but did not fully command. Morning would bring the magistrate appointment, the first formal attempt to turn their string of evidence into an instrument the law would wield. It would also bring the possibility of leaks, a smear in the paper, a pushback from advisors who preferred damage control to structural reform. It would bring 100 small challenges. Amara placed the photograph face down on the table and buttoned Eli's favorite sweater. She tightened the bracelet on her wrist until the thread dug in just enough to remind her that she was anchored. She thought of Marcus teaching in a room of boys and girls who expected simple proofs of the world. She thought of Charles, who had owned a jet and a house and had been taught distance as a kind of safety. She thought of Victor, who had carried a gun into a hangar because he had been offered money that had been heavy enough to weigh a conscience. There was one more thing Amara could not let go of, the sense that this was not only about them. The ledger items, the VIP rotate lines, the servers in racks, they were an industry. They were a business model that had found a market in the visibility of others. If they could show that market and the people who propped it, perhaps they could buy a little space back for people like Marcus and Eli and Amara herself. Margaret's office smelled of old paper and coffee. She had a marked folder that made the warrant look like a promise. Daniel had circled times and assigned roles. They would go to the magistrate with a case thick enough to merit seizure. The storage facility had not yet been touched. The servers hummed on someone else's electricity, unknowing. Amara glanced at the photograph one last time before she left the house. The word on its back scraped at her mind. Everything has a cost. She understood now that the cost could be measured in small things. Time out of children's lives, fear that disguised itself as routine, the quiet work of people who kept houses running, who were now compelled to bear witness. The cost could also be a ledger entry in a spreadsheet, an anonymized payment to a shell company. The cost was both human and financial, private and public. She left the house in the grey light of morning, the bracelet snug on her wrist and the word "tonight" still beating like a small clock behind her sternum. The legal machinery would turn, slowly and with friction. They would go to the magistrate and then, if everything held, to the storage facility. If everything did not hold, they would return to the long work of building a case. The city responded in its indifferent ways. Cabs hissing past, neon signs blinking like indifferent witnesses, and the morning press already circling the edges of Whitmore Holdings' quiet neighborhood. Margaret arrived at the magistrate's office with a dossier that smelled faintly of fresh paper and sharper coffee. She had rehearsed the language with prosecutors until the phrases felt like tools at hand: probable cause, nexus, exigent circumstances, chain of custody. The magistrate listened with the careful impartiality of someone who had seen too many men turn urgency into entitlement. The affidavit was not dramatic on its face. It was built of small certainties. There was the microdot signal and its relay pattern. There were Vanessa's invoices, each line item connecting money to stream labels. There was Victor's statement naming Elias Kane. There were photographs of the bug and the demonstration of how a seemingly benign ornament hid a microphone. Margaret had also included a carefully notarized log of the coffee stall meeting, time, place, the USB photographed against a neutral backdrop, and the names of witnesses who had observed Vanessa hand it over. It was, Margaret said afterward, a stitched case, no single thread that would hold alone, but together strong enough to ask for a search. The magistrate granted the warrant with a patience that implied the law's weariness of absolutes. "Be precise," he told them, as Daniel and a small task force signed the paper. "Respect property and privacy. Describe everything you seize. You will be accountable for the chain." His words were a legal metronome. Each one required action. The seizure of the storage complex was a map of small humiliations for a system built on secrecy. It was not a cinematic rupture so much as a slow, bureaucratic dismantling. Every unit that opened revealed password-protected racks, boxes of labeled hard drives, and in one cavernous unit near the back, a bank of servers humming like a captured storm. The lights in that room were spare and cold. LEDs blinked in slow, merciless rhythm. Technicians in gloves photographed serial numbers, opened encryption containers, and applied forensic imaging tools that left a perfect ghost copy of each drive. an image for analysis that preserved the original's integrity. The phrase VIP rotate was found on an internal note attached to a folder of manifests. Labels matched what Vanessa had provided. Whitmore, boardroom 0312, 7:15 p.m. Residential, suite 14A, 22109. Client, confidential, rotate. The language was banal and industrial, the language of accounting, codes, timestamps, SLAs, service-level agreements, that reduced bedrooms to deliverables. Watching a young technician scroll through time-coded streams, Margaret felt the moral vertigo of the thing. Private rooms reduced to product lines, intimate moments catalogued like inventory. They did not find everything. Some drives had been damaged. Others carried the quick, practiced erasure of people who understood legal processes. But the imaging captured enough. Streams, time codes, and a small catalogue of labels that linked to Vanessa's invoices. The forensics team extracted packet headers, server routing information, and hashes that, when combined with banking records, formed a latticework of connection. It was technical work that read like a slow unspooling of the market's architecture. Payments, relays, exit nodes, rather than a cinematic unmasking of a single villain. As the images rolled on secure monitors, one of the younger analysts pointed out something mundane and crucial. A maintenance log showing a technician's badge swiped at a particular hour on a day when one of the VIP streams began. The swipe was a bureaucratic breadcrumb. It led to a vendor contact who in turn led back to invoices bearing the name Elias Kane. Kane, as Margaret had already briefed them, was not a caricature of malice. He was a financier of the industry, someone who had the civic clout to sit on philanthropic boards and the appetite to monetize privacy. The law they wanted now was not only criminal, it was reputational and fiscal. Daniel coordinated the physical element of the plan that would unfurl at the gala. The ballroom, swathed in linen and low golden light, was to be the trap without obvious teeth. Agents arranged themselves as waiters, florists, and catering staff, dispersed strategically to avoid undue notice. Technical watchers parked themselves behind decorative screens, tuned to listen for the particular traffic signature of Kane's relays that Vanessa had described. They were not trying to catch Kane in a violent act. They were trying to catch his network in the act of trading sight for a fee. If a labeled stream lit up with the VIP rotate tag, that would be the probable cause needed to seize live feeds and trace their source. Amara returned to the Getty room the night of the gala with the same steady competence she had always brought. Her uniform was a dark, practical dress she could move in. Her hands, which had smoothed ties and folded the linens, moved without attention. Eli was there, too, his smallness paradoxically easing some of the spectacle. When he clung to her calf, she steadied herself with the mechanical calm of a person used to being the anchor in a certain world. Daniel took a quick look and hinted toward the back, where an agent pretended to fuss with a wine cart. Margaret's team sat in a gallery behind a row of palms, their laptops open like quiet instruments. The gala itself was a study in theatre. Charles Whitmore, who had become publicly attentive to the scandal, made a short speech about transparency and the obligations of wealth. His words were careful, his voice threaded with both grief and a newly sharpened moral tension. He would later say under oath that he had wanted to make his company's culture reflexively different. In the moment his speech served as the public stage Margaret needed. Cameras rolled. Donors smiled for photographs. The room glowed with jewelry and carefully managed laughter. Amara moved through it like a seamstress among costumes, opening a door here, smoothing a napkin there. Her presence was unremarkable by design. Then, at precisely the moment when one of the server's labels had been predicted to refresh, a quiet signature appeared on a monitor in the corner where Margaret watched. The label read, in the bland typography of technical administration, Whitmore Boardroom, Live, VIP Rotate 0312, Local. The signal was a small, triumphant thing. It meant the network was live and, crucially, using a label they had documented repeatedly in the invoices. Daniel, hearing the alert in his earpiece, moved a waiter into a position to signal an agent across the room. The sting unfolded with legal restraint. A team approached the service stair and, under the supervision of a magistrate liaison, who had been roped into the operation, disabled the relay's local receiver. Technicians who had been planted as caterers removed a small rack that appeared to be part of the event's AV equipment. It was, in fact, a disguised node that relayed the feed out to Kane's cluster. No one fired a gun. There was no cinematic collapse. There was, instead, a practical, tense dismantling, wires unplugged, a discrete seam cut along an amplifier's backplate, and then a signal that fell silent. At the same time, other teams used the warrant to access live streams at the storage facility where the relays connected. Forensic imagers took rolling snapshots of the network, capturing IP fingerprints and routing logs. It was a technical ballet performed under legal umbrellas. Margaret later described the exhilaration as tedious to the point of beauty, an awkward phrase that nonetheless contained the strange pleasure of seeing bureaucracy and citizenry align. Victor's cooperation proved to be catalytic. Under the weight of evidence and the promise of reduced charges contingent on full testimony, he gave names and meeting times. He admitted he had been paid, and he spoke of a handler who worked to keep low-level operators insulated. He described vehicles, pickup spots, a van that sometimes doubled as a relay node, and a roster of operatives who took payments through intermediaries. He said Kane's name again, Elias Kane, the man who gave orders through invoices and vetted vendors by philanthropic association. The arrest of Elias Kane did not happen that night. Brilliant narratives prefer abrupt climaxes, but real life prefers a different drumbeat. Kane's empire had lawyers and layers. The team needed financial warrants, which required bank cooperation across states, and in some cases, letters rogatory to foreign jurisdictions. Tracing funds through shell accounts took time and patience. Margaret's team moved methodically, freezing accounts where court permission allowed, issuing subpoenas to banks and payment processors, and working with federal offices to scope out Kane's holdings. Still, the ripples were immediate. The network's mid-level operatives found themselves exposed. A handful were taken into custody over weeks, some pleading guilty, others making deals to protect their own families. Vanessa, who had given the USB, agreed to testify under a protective order, her voice steady, but small in a courtroom where legal drama tried to dress itself as emotion. Victor, whose cooperation had been the hinge, pled to a reduced sentence in exchange for his testimony and detailed recollection. His guilt was palpable, but mitigated by his evident remorse. Daniel watched him across a table during interviews, and something like pity passed between them, a recognition that the market they had entered could push ordinary people toward desperate choices. The trial phase was a tangle. Kane's legal team waged a methodical campaign, challenged the chain of custody, attacked the metadata's integrity, questioned the authority of magistrates who had granted warrants. They filed motions, made procedural inquiries, and deployed expert witnesses to dispute the interpretation of packet headers and relay identification. The defense was not theatrical so much as exhausting. Each challenge required Margaret's team and the DA to re-explain processes, produce the meticulous logs, and demonstrate that forensic imaging produced immutable copies. It was slow work, papers, depositions, subpoenas for phone records and accountant notes. Amara's role in the courtroom was small in duration but large in effect. She testified to the hangar moment, to the discovery of the gun, and to the vibration of the world when she found herself unexpectedly visible. On the stand, she spoke plainly. Her voice was not performative. It did not aim for drama. She described the biomechanics of smoothing a tie, the motion that made her look under the chauffeur's seat, the exact angle of the glove when she pulled the bug's ornament. When defense counsel tried to paint her as uncertain, She simply repeated what she had done and felt, and the small solidity of that truth resisted embellishment. The defense attempted the usual tactics, suggesting misremembered timelines, implying chain-of-custody errors, and hinting that invoices could be manufactured. Margaret's team countered with their documented logs, timestamps from the coffee stall, image hashes, bank transfers corroborated by banking subpoenas, and surveillance from the storage facility. Vanessa's testimony about vendor coding, those brutal, business-like notations, anchored the prosecution's narrative in the everyday language of commerce. VIP rotate did not sound like a smoking gun until it was shown to be the same label that appeared in invoices paid by shell companies connected to Kane's accounts. Pleadings and plea deals moved through the court like circumspect beasts. Several mid-level defendants pleaded guilty to conspiracy and trafficking in surveillance data, agreeing to provide testimony in exchange for lighter sentences. These plea deals were pragmatic. Prosecuting a whole chain to its apex would have meant an interminable legal battle with uncertain outcomes. Securing convictions against those who had built and operated the network reduced the harm and produced concrete records. Kane himself contested the charges vehemently. His public response was a mixture of indignation and aloof promises of cooperation pending due process. The press narrative, meanwhile, turned complex. Some outlets painted Kane as a pariah, others framed the case as an exposure of an industry hidden in amber. Whitmore Holdings, under Charles's leadership and public contrition, rolled out reforms, vendor vetting processes, explicit ethical clauses in contracts, the creation of an internal oversight office, and commitments to staff protections for domestic workers. Charles made gestures that would have felt performative in a different context, publicly backing legal reforms to increase transparency in vendor relations and calling for industry-wide audits. He did not escape scrutiny. Indeed, some critics argued his company had been a client of services that commodified privacy. But the board's decision to reform signaled a shift from passive wealth to something like accountability. Amara was offered a formal role she had not imagined, an ethics liaison position to work within the new oversight office, a job meant to bridge household staff concerns, vendor relations, and company policy. The offer came with paperwork and a stipend and a set of responsibilities that would require skill beyond the domestic tasks she had always performed. It would mean training in basic privacy rights, access to complaint procedures, and a seat at a table where the company would consider the human consequences of contracts. The offer felt like recognition, and also like recruitment into a bureaucracy she did not trust. She took time to consider it, balancing the safety it could provide against the possible constraints of institutionally framed work. Marcus, once the immediate danger subsided, returned to the classroom with a new understanding of the world outside his chalkboard proofs. He took a few weeks of leave, taught remotely for a while, and then returned to his students with a gentleness that had been sharpened by fear and gratitude. He carried no sense of martyrdom. He resumed his routines with a sense of fidelity to his classroom. Children noticed when their teacher's jokes were softer, when he paused to give more time for answers. He did not speak often of the photograph or of the van from which it had been taken. He would later say in a quiet conversation with Amara that the experience had altered his sense of how fragile ordinary safety could be. The rescue of Marcus, the sequence that had felt like a possible headline, had in reality been a coordinated interception built on a lucky stretch of timing. Agents had wiretapped the van's communications with the relay network at a point when Kane's system attempted to activate a live stream. The traffic signature matched the VIP rotate pattern, and a unit that had been waiting with a search warrant for the specific vehicle intercepted it on a quiet side street. Marcus was found inside, shaken and bewildered, but otherwise unharmed. There was no cinematic struggle. There was an officer who knelt and offered him water and a blanket. Marcus's gratitude to Amara when they met afterward in a secure room was wordless. He simply took her hands and squeezed them as if counting numbers on fingers. Yet the legal aftermath was messy. Kane's lawyers filed motions to suppress evidence obtained from certain servers, arguing jurisdictional overreach and technical misidentification of exit nodes. Some magistrates sided with the defense on narrow points, ordering that certain segments of data be excluded because proper warrants had not been obtained for foreign-based servers. Others upheld the prosecution's approach, determining that when domestic relays had been used, legal process had been observed. The result was a patchwork of rulings that felt to Margaret like a partially mended net, usable but not perfect. In the end, Kane faced charges related to conspiracy, trafficking of surveillance services, and negligent privacy practices. Several of his executives took plea deals, agreeing to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced sentences. Kane himself, after protracted litigation, accepted a plea arrangement on a subset of charges in exchange for restitution measures and cooperation in revealing the network's customers, terms that to some felt disappointingly pragmatic. He would pay fines, his philanthropic boards would ask him to step down from visible posts, and regulators would initiate inquiries into the broader industry. But the criminal justice outcome was necessarily imperfect. Trials had been long, evidentiary disputes common, and public attention fickle. The structural problem, an industry that had found a market in visibility, did not disappear with his conviction. It had been exposed, and that was a start. Whitmore Holdings' reforms felt substantive, though not absolute. The company instituted a vendor audit team with teeth. It implemented mandatory privacy clauses in contracts, created channels for domestic workers to report suspicious vendor behavior, and funded a public policy unit to lobby for clearer regulation of surveillance commerce. Dan and Margaret consulted on the policies, arguing for enforceable transparency and for mechanisms that would prevent the auctioning of intimacy. Charles pressed the board to make reparative donations to community organizations that supported privacy literacy in schools and neighborhoods where impacted families lived. Gerald Clean, the board member who had earlier listened like an observer, lent his influence to instituting oversight. He later noted to a reporter that reform is a series of small, stubborn acts, a phrase that became a kind of shorthand for corporate apology and accountability. Amara accepted the ethics liaison role after weeks of deliberation. She negotiated terms that mattered to her, a guarantee that she would retain custody of vacation time to visit Marcus, and that any attendance at board meetings would include a translator for corporate language into the practical register. She insisted on a clause ensuring non-retaliation and a mechanism for anonymous staff reporting. Charles signed the paperwork with a quiet gratitude that felt less like absolution and more like a reprieve. The role was modest in title, but capacious in daily work. She listened to complaints, trained household staff on privacy basics, and convened meetings with vendor relations to ask practical, sometimes blunt questions. There were costs. Amara's life became more public, interview requests came, and with them a gnawing temptation to be used as a symbol. She declined most, preferring to say that the work mattered more than her story. Victor's sentence, reduced through cooperation, meant he served time, but also worked with community programs focused on reintegration. Vanessa moved her family away and testified under protective provisions. She later found employment with a non-profit focused on vendor transparency. The personal costs had not vanished, but they had been acknowledged in ways that had legal and institutional ramifications. In court, Amara's testimony had been restrained and precise. She had been asked questions that tried to poke at uncertainties, to fracture memory with legal nuance. She answered in the language of the life she had always known, simple, exact, and unadorned. It was effective. The jury, where one was impaneled for some of the trials, responded not to drama, but to the weight of documented detail laid across the evidence table. The invoices, the server images, the time-coded streams, the pleas of mid-level operatives. It was the sort of proof that moved slowly, but did move. The public aftershocks were uneven. Some legislators proposed bills to regulate the sale of live surveillance streams and to impose stricter vendor vetting. Privacy advocacy groups used the case as a touchstone for public education campaigns. Tech companies issued statements promising better controls across platforms. The market contracted. Certain vendors found clients more wary, contracts more scrutinized. The industry did not vanish, but its margins thinned. In the quieter rooms of Whitmore's household, life stitched itself back with care. Eli returned to school with a pocket of resilience he could not name. He slept without the same sudden start that had haunted him for nights. Marcus rebuilt his routines. Amara resumed the domestic rhythms that had given her steadiness and found new purpose in translating corporate obligations into practical protections for people who kept houses running. She trained teams not as charity, but as a practical safeguard, insisting that policies be clear and enforceable. The bracelet Marcus had braided remained on her wrist. It collected the small marks of life, a faint fray where a sleeve brushed it, a tiny darkening from the grease of a car engine she had once helped to clean, the shine it took when rubbed in nervous moments. Sometimes she would touch it and think of tonight as a map, one moment that rippled outward into policy, courtrooms, raids, and, crucially, small acts that changed the calculus of protection. The word had not lost its weight. It had become a marker of ongoing vigilance. There were no tidy endings. Kane's conviction, partial and negotiated, felt like a victory and an admonition. The men who ran the relay farms found other clients. Regulators found limits in jurisdiction. But the public conversation had shifted. Vendors had to answer more questions. Boards had to listen to staff they had once ignored. Those were small shifts, but meaningful ones. Amara's days filled with meetings where her domestic instincts became policy instruments. A training session on recognizing suspicious AV equipment. A live demonstration on how invoices could be coded to hide services, a hotline number laminated and placed discreetly inside staff rooms. More than once, she caught herself explaining things she had never thought she would need to explain. How to photograph a device while preserving its evidentiary value. How to write a log entry with time, place, and witness. She taught people how to be ordinary and safe at the same time. On a late spring morning, months after the initial hangar incident, Whitmore Holdings opened its doors to a small community event. The company called it an Ethical Vendor Summit and Open House. Neighbors were invited, as were staff and some of the people affected by the case. Charles spoke to a room that included people who had once been at a remove from the company's decisions. He did not beg forgiveness. He offered a new set of commitments and acknowledged that the company's previous distance from the domestic consequences of its procurement had been a moral failure. The words were not grand, but they were precise. Transparent contracts, staff protections, an independent ombudsperson. The company pledged funds to privacy education programs in local schools. Amara stood at the back of the room, a small, steady presence. Marcus was there, not as some symbol but as a teacher who had been returned to his classroom. Eli ran in the garden outside with a group of other children, their laughter a thin, ordinary rejoinder to the earlier tension of nights. Margaret and Daniel were present in the crowd. They had altered their relationship from colleagues in an emergency to pragmatic partners in an ongoing civic work. After the formal remarks, people drifted into smaller circles. A young housekeeper approached Amara, hands shaking, and asked practical questions about how to raise concerns. Amara listened, and then answered with the kind of plainness she had learned to cultivate in this strange season. Write it down, photograph it, tell someone you trust. If you have no one, call the hotline. It's not as dramatic as it sounds. It's a habit. She said the things she had wished someone had told her earlier, and the housekeeper left with a laminated card and a firmer step. That evening, Amara sat at her kitchen table with a small journal open. She had been keeping the book intermittently, notes that flared into sentences and then folded back into ordinary life. Eli had a new tooth coming. Marcus had agreed to a speaking engagement at the local college about data literacy for teachers. Vanessa had found a job with a non-profit. Victor was in a program that combined community service with counseling. None of these outcomes erased the cost, but they were tangible. Amara touched the bracelet on her wrist. "Tonight," she murmured, and the word felt full. It had once been a sharpened arrow, a time that measured immediate danger. Now it was a rhythm marker, a reminder that vigilance is not only a moment, but a practice that must be repeated. She thought of the servers, those blinking teeth in a cavernous room, and of the quiet way legal instruments had been used to turn the tide. She thought of the ordinary people whose lives had been catalogued and how the labor of recognition had become collective. Her phone buzzed with a short message from Charles's office, an invitation to a small advisory committee meeting on vendor transparency. She considered refusing. The offer carried the memory of being visible in a way that had once endangered her. Then she thought of Marcus's students and of the children outside laughing in the garden. She typed a single line, "I'll come, tell me when." She slept that night with Eli's small foot tucked against her calf and the photograph of Marcus face down in the drawer where she had folded it months before. The world was quieter than it had been in those first frenzied days, but quietness was not safety. It was respite. Tonight had stopped being only a threat and had become, for her, a practice of attention. Weeks later, at the first meeting of the Independent Ombudsperson's Committee, Amara was seated across from a room of people who represented legal counsel, human resources, and outside privacy advocates. She listened and then spoke, not as an outsider now, but as someone who knew both the texture of silk ties and the procedural curvature of warrants. She did not use academic language. She spoke of small things, the placement of a credenza, the vibration of a jet's hum, the exact angle that made a bug invisible. She insisted that policies include concrete steps, unannounced audits, clear whistleblower protections, and mandatory training for domestic staff. The committee listened. It was a small victory, but again meaningful. Policy would be updated, oversight mechanisms would be funded. The company would publish a report on vendor relationships. It would not cure all ills, nor would it fix the broader market that had monetized visibility. But within the company's walls, a culture had shifted enough that the next tonight might unfold differently. On a cool evening, some months after the raids, Amara returned to the hangar to close a loop. Charles had arranged, quietly, for a simple gathering to thank those whose lives had been altered by the case. Security teams, Margaret's unit, and a few others. They stood under the same cold blue light, the jet like a sleeping animal behind them. Victor was not invited. He had his own path, and the company respected the terms of his reintegration. Charles approached Amara, and with a careful private gratitude handed her a small envelope. Inside was a check intended to fund an education account for Eli and to fund privacy literacy classes in Marcus's school. "This isn't the same as listening to your life," he said, "but it's the least we can do." Amara accepted, fingered the edges of the paper, and felt the old geometric habits of thrift align with a new sense of possibility. "We need systems," she said, "but we also need people to learn how to use them." Night arrived with its habitual hum. The servers, where they still existed for other clients, blinked elsewhere. The city turned its lights on and off, like a person remembering to breathe. Amara walked home with Marcus, who had stopped to buy a pen for a student, and Eli at her side, tired and satisfied from a day of play. They crossed streets that smelled faintly of summer and asphalt. In their small human arc, the arc of life continued, quiet, unrehearsed, real. In the years that followed, the case they had prosecuted remained a touchstone. Legislators cited it when proposing regulations. Privacy advocates used its invoices to demonstrate the market's mechanisms. Whitmore Holdings continued to publish reports on vendor compliance. Margaret moved into a federal role that allowed her to push for more cohesive oversight across jurisdictions. Daniel remained the sober center of Whitmore's security operations, teaching a new generation of officers how to balance vigilance with respect. Amara kept her bracelet. It frayed in a small place, but did not break. She sat sometimes in the garden behind the house and watched Eli practice the whistle he had been learning. His sound had lost some of the tentative edges of those first nights. Marcus taught his students about proofs and, occasionally, about civic responsibility in small, practical ways. Vanessa's name appeared in a newsletter celebrating whistleblowers who had chosen to help reform systems rather than vanish. On a late summer night, not unlike the one when she had first said those two surprising words in the hangar, Amara stood by the kitchen window and looked out at the city. The lights were steady. Somewhere, servers hummed. Somewhere else, a child's laughter threaded across an apartment. She ran her thumb along the braid of her bracelet and felt the knot Marcus had tied years before. The bracelet was not a talisman that ensured safety. It was a reminder that small acts could change larger structures. "Tonight," she said into the quiet, and the word was not merely a clock, but a promise. It meant watchfulness, the patient accumulation of careful practices, a refusal to accept privacy as a commodity without human costs. It meant that when someone else felt the slow creep of being watched, there would be channels, people and laws that could be called upon, imperfect, slow but present. The city was indifferent in many ways, but in the rooms she inhabited and the little policies she helped craft, it had shifted. She had been seen in a way that cost her and rewarded her in different measures. She had saved a child from a moment of violence, and through that small act had activated a long, slow chain of accountability. She placed the photograph of Marcus into a small folder now labeled personal, not to hide it, but to preserve it as evidence of spurs toward change. She thought of the men who had made trade of other people's lives and of the many whose livelihoods had been complicated by their choices. She thought of Elias Kane, who had been convicted on some counts and required to compensate victims in ways that felt both inadequate and necessary. She thought of the countless unnamed clients who might still seek to buy sight. Amara breathed in the summer night and felt the old rhythm of domestic work settle into something broader, an ethic of care that could be scaled into policy. She closed her journal and put it on the table. Eli called from the next room for a story. Marcus knocked and entered with a stack of papers, lesson plans and a note from the school thanking him for his patience and courage. They sat together, small and ordinary, linked by threads that had been tightened and tested. Before the house quieted for the night, Amara slipped the bracelet, now slightly frayed, over her wrist. She whispered the word again, "Tonight," and let it keep its metronome. It was a promise to remain attentive, to remember that visibility carried cost as well as power, and that those with means had moral obligations that extended beyond charity into the scaffolding of systems. Outside, the city continued its slow rotation, lights on, lights off, servers blinking like a distant heartbeat. Inside, a family moved through the ordinary motions of a night not entirely untroubled, but steadier than it had been. The case had not solved everything. It had only opened a path. Amara had, in the small geometry of her life, stepped from the role of invisible competence into one of quiet accountability. She had spoken, and the world had listened enough to change a little. If you feel this story moved you, share it with someone who believes we must watch the watchers.